Hello everyone, welcome back to History 1151. In this video, we are going to discuss the new United States of America from 1783 to about 1812, what historians call the early Republic period. We will discuss the issues that the people of the United States, and North America writ large, faced in the years following the nation's founding and separation from Great Britain. We will also discuss how these issues define the politics and culture of the early republic. In the years following the American Revolutionary War, the people of the United States faced a great deal of turmoil and uncertainty. The war had been very expensive, and the nation's paper currency was highly inflated with minimal purchasing power. The United States government, defined by the Articles of Confederation, written in 1777, ratified in 1781, did not have the authority to collect taxes to cover the debt of the American Revolutionary War, or even pay veterans of the Continental Army. A lack of payment almost caused a mutiny and military coup among the Continental Army's officer corps in 1783, called the Newburgh Conspiracy, as the Revolutionary War was winding down. The planned mutiny was canceled due to the intercession of General George Washington, who convinced the angry officers that a military takeover of the United States Civilian Congress would betray the principles of the American Revolution. Washington humbly reminded the officers of the sacrifices they had made, risking life and limb to fight the British. Then, Washington convinced them to sacrifice a little more, giving up their pensions to secure the financial success of the fledgling American nation. The Newburgh Conspiracy, while it never went beyond the planning stage, demonstrated the weakness of the Articles of Confederation, particularly when it came to the collection of taxes. There are numerous examples in world history of how important it is that civilizations adequately pay and fund their military to prevent ambitious generals and unpaid officers from rebelling against civil authority. Events like the 1783 Newburgh Conspiracy convinced the U.S. Congress that more government authority was needed to secure the nation's financial future and to pay the people who had made independence possible. The Articles of Confederation held the 13 states together in a loose sense, but this document also did not have the authority to intercede between state governments and their residents. In the Articles of Confederation, the state governments were far more powerful than the federal government, whose power was dependent entirely on state cooperation. The weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation would also be demonstrated during Shays' Rebellion of 1786 through 1787. In the Massachusetts backcountry, where the American Revolutionary War had begun, Daniel Shays, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, had fallen into debt because of the inflation of the new American currencies. Many other rural farmers had similar problems. The farmers had few assets beyond their land. They took out loans and bought items from coastal merchants on credit, using their land as collateral. When the farmers failed to pay their debts, the merchants would try to take control of the farmers' land. To make matters worse, the merchants, especially foreign ones, refused to accept paper scrip for payment of bills, demanding gold and silver coins instead, because inflation had made paper currency almost worthless in the United States. Keep in mind, there was not one single currency in the United States at this point. Paper bills were printed by state and municipal banks, and the bills were intended to be promissory notes that could be exchanged for gold or silver. The debts of the war and the United States' inability to collect taxes created inflation due to a shortage of gold and silver in the banks to back up the paper money. Contemporary Americans preferred to be paid in gold and silver as well, and they remarked that paper money was good for nothing except to be a bandage. This was the background into which Shays' Rebellion took place. When debt collectors and local law enforcement tried to enforce the confiscation of the indebted farmers' land, rural Massachusetts people protested the evictions and seizure of farms. Veterans also refused to pay state taxes until they had been fully paid for their service during the Revolutionary War. The protesters were called regulators because they wanted to reform the Massachusetts government. The regulators escalated the protests in 1786, closing Massachusetts county courts, where the collections and evictions were authorized by local judges. The U.S. Congress's president, John Hancock, signer of the Declaration of Independence, was a populist who tacitly supported the regulators, but Massachusetts' state governor, James Bowdoin, in contrast to Hancock, stepped up the collection of taxes and tried to enforce evictions as well. Governor Bowdoin also had support of William Shepard, the Massachusetts militia commander, and General Benjamin Lincoln, a former Continental Army officer who raised his own army to confront the regulators, financed by the merchants. The regulators, in contrast, actually sought assistance from the British in Canada and the Mohawk Indians, both of whom were their former enemies. The Massachusetts militia and the regulators clashed several times in the Bay State's backcountry. The regulators fought against the militia, but their rebellion ultimately collapsed after they failed to capture a federal armory in Springfield. Without adequate weapons, the regulators were unable to resist the militia, and the rebellion collapsed. Most of the Shays' Rebellion leaders fled to Vermont, which was not fully part of the United States at this point. Several of the regulator conspirators, including Shays, were captured. Some were executed, although Shays himself was pardoned in 1788, and he eventually received a pension for his military service. Thousands of lower-level regulators signed confessions in exchange for amnesty. Events like Daniel Shays' rebellion convinced America's political leaders the United States of America needed to have a federal government that could supersede the authority of the states. Before the rebellion, the states frequently ignored the Articles of Confederation and the dictates of the American Congress, preventing the payment of war debts or the intercession between American citizens and the state governments. Shays' rebellion also showed that the Articles of Confederation did not have the authority to suppress domestic insurgencies and insurrections, as the regulators had been defeated by the Massachusetts militia and Benjamin Lincoln's private army, rather than the Confederation government. Consequently, in the late spring of 1787, America's political leaders met in Philadelphia for a federal convention, ostensibly held to revise the Articles of Confederation. The primary organizers of the convention, Alexander Hamilton of New York and James Madison of Virginia, really wanted to create a new government for the United States, rather than simply revise the existing Confederation. Delegates generally agreed that more federal power was needed to keep the United States together, to pay debts and provide for the common defense, but the delegates disagreed on how this power should be established and how it should be checked and countered as well. One initial proposal was Virginian James Madison's Virginia Plan, which called for a very powerful federal government with almost no checks and balances by which the states could counter federal authority. Madison was a committed American nationalist and believed the needs of the American nation as a whole should override the concerns of the states. Others, like Charles Pinckney of South Carolina, proposed similar plans, which called for a strong federal government. Over time, the delegates recognized that the federal government ought to have checks and balances within itself, leading Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania to call for the creation of a separate legislative, executive, and judicial branches, which would have different roles in the government system. The legislative branch, Congress, would make and pass laws. The executive branch, under the President of the United States, would enforce Congress's laws. The judicial branch, with the federal Supreme Court at the head, would hear cases and interpret Congress's laws, determining how the law should be enforced. Additional revisions were made to this three-branch plan, namely the creation of a bicameral Congress. The bicameral Congress would contain two chambers, similar to the British Parliament, which had a House of Lords and a House of Commons. The Virginia Plan did not initially state how delegates would be appointed or allocated for this Congress, but it suggested that they might be issued based on population or tax revenue, which would give the larger states more control over the federal government. In contrast to the Virginia Plan, delegates also proposed the New Jersey Plan, which called for a weaker executive branch, where the military was controlled by both the executive and the legislature, more like the Articles of Confederation. In addition, the New Jersey Plan called for a unicameral, one-chamber Congress, where each state would have an equal number of representatives, like the U.S. Senate today. In general, larger states like Virginia favored the Virginia Plan and the creation of a larger federal government and proportional representation in Congress, which would give the large states more legislative authority because of their larger populations. Smaller states tended to favor the New Jersey Plan with its Senate, primarily because this system would give all states, big and small, an equal say in the legislature. Alexander Hamilton proposed a radical plan that called for a very strong federal government with lifetime appointed senators and an executive called governor that would rule for life as well. Hamilton's plan also greatly diminished the power of states. The radicalness of Hamilton's plan has led some scholars to speculate that Alexander Hamilton was secretly a monarchist who wanted America to have a king. Others suggest that Hamilton was being pragmatic, proposing an unacceptably strong federal government to make Madison's Virginia plan seem moderate in comparison. Whatever his motivations, it does appear that his plan inspired delegates to vote against the limited government New Jersey Plan in favor of Madison's Virginia system, which called for a strong federal government with states having some power as well. Roger Sherman, a delegate from Connecticut and former framer of the Declaration of Independence, proposed a compromise between the Virginia and New Jersey plans. Sherman's plan broke the federal government into three branches: executive, judicial, and legislative, like the Virginia plan. The legislative branch would be bicameral with two chambers. The lower chamber, the House of Representatives, would be allocated based on population, and the upper chamber, the Senate, would allocate 2 senators per state. This bicameral legislature, with both proportional and equal representation between states, was deemed acceptable by both large and small states. Large states benefited from the House, and small states like the Senate. After Sherman's Connecticut Compromise became the most popular proposal for the new U.S. government, the delegates debated how the population of the states should be determined. Should allocation of representatives be based on all of the residents of the states, or should only U.S. citizens be considered for the purpose of representation? What about the unfree residents of states, namely enslaved people? Southern delegates from the slave states naturally demanded that slaves be considered in the state's population count to increase their own representation in the House. Enslaved people would still not be given freedom or the rights of citizens. Delegates from northern states, like Roger Sherman of Connecticut, stated that only free residents should be counted for representation. Remember, Connecticut had abolished slavery in 1784, 3 years before the Constitutional Convention was held. In the end, the delegates reached another compromise regarding representative apportionment. This agreement was called the ThreeFifths Compromise. The ThreeFifths Compromise mandated that, for representation purposes, enslaved people should be counted as 3/5, while a free resident, regardless of race, was assigned the value of 1. Contrary to popular belief, this did not mean that the United States of America originally considered black people to be 3/5 of a person. Free black citizens were counted as 1, whereas enslaved black people were counted as 3/5. The ThreeFifths Compromise was established to keep the slave states from gaining an unfair share of representatives in Congress. The slaveholding delegates of the southern states wanted enslaved people to count as one, whereas the delegates from the northern states, which were in the process of abolishing slavery, wanted slaves to count as 0, because they were not citizens and could not vote. This compromise was not created to devalue the humanity of black people. It was created to minimize the power that the southern slave states would have in the U.S. government. It actually would have been better for black people as a whole if enslaved African Americans counted as 0 instead of 3/5 or even 1. The discussion of the 3/5 Compromise prompts another question. Was the Constitution a pro-slavery or anti-slavery document? Or was the Constitution somewhere in between these two ideals? Scholars have debated this question for decades, making arguments in favor of either of these two questions. Proponents of the argument that the Constitution was pro-slavery cite the 3/5 Compromise, which favored southern slave states far more than it did northern states, by allocating House representatives to some of the southern states' enslaved population. The Constitution would also include a clause which declared that, quote, a person held to service or labor in one state, end quote, but had escaped to another, would not be discharged from their service, regardless of the laws of the new state they had entered. This service could be interpreted to include a variety of types of forced labor: apprenticeships, indentured servitude, convict labor, and slavery. The clause did not use the term slavery or slave. They also point out that at least 1/3 of the 55 Constitutional Convention delegates had owned slaves at some point in their lives. People who believe that the Constitution was anti-slavery point out the fact that the word slavery does not appear in the original Constitution or Bill of Rights, and that slavery is not referenced until the 13th Amendment of 1865, which abolished enslavement in the U.S. People who support the idea that the Constitution was anti-slavery also point out that the Constitution allowed for the abolition of the slave trade by 1808, and that pro-slavery delegates' proposals for protection of slavery were rejected. In truth, the Constitution was a document that could be interpreted and used by both pro-slavery and anti-slavery politicians to justify their respective political stances. In September of 1787, a majority of the Constitutional Convention delegates signed the document that would become the U.S. Constitution, the supreme law of the land. 39 of the 55 delegates signed the document, leading to the beginning of the ratification process, wherein each state would vote to approve or reject the Constitution. Some delegates had already left the convention and thus were unable to sign, while others refused to sign because they opposed the kind of government the Constitution created. Still others, like George Mason of Virginia, refused to sign the Constitution, wanting a Bill of Rights to be included, which would protect the liberties of the American people and provide additional checks and balances on the federal government's power over the citizenry. After the signing of the Constitution, the ratification process began. American politicians who supported the Constitution and called on the states to ratify the document. They were called Federalists, while those opposed to the Constitution were called Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists believed that they should actually be called Federalists because they thought the states should be organized under a federation rather than a central government. But we will not dwell on this point here. Some leading Federalists were Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, the Constitution's primary author. Leading Anti-Federalists included former delegates like George Mason of Virginia, but also men like Patrick Henry, also of Virginia, who had refused to attend the Constitutional Convention. Samuel Adams, the brother of John Adams, like George Mason, initially opposed the Constitution, arguing that it needed a Bill of Rights to be ratified. Supporters of federalism and anti-federalism authored a series of pamphlets called the Federalist and Anti-Federalist Papers. In these documents, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists wrote under pseudonyms, usually taken from classical Greco-Roman history. In these papers, the authors tried to sway public opinion either in favor or against ratification of the Constitution. The Constitution was ratified in 1790, with even Rhode Island, which had been bitterly opposed to the document, coming around to the new federal government. Rhode Island and several other hesitant states ratified the Constitution, but only under the agreement that the Constitution would be amended or changed to include a Bill of Rights. During the ratification process, the first U.S. presidential election took place in 1788. George Washington, the former commander of the Continental Army and presiding member of the Constitutional Convention, was the leading candidate. Several other candidates ran, including John Hancock and John Adams. No candidate was part of a political party, but the candidates tended to have either Federalist or Anti-Federalist political leanings. Washington, a very popular figure, hero of the Revolutionary War, and one of the richest men in the nation, won every state that was eligible to vote in the presidential election. At the time, the second-place candidate would become the vice president, or president of the Senate, to check the chief executive's power. The second-place candidate was John Adams. Washington would serve 2 terms as president, being unanimously re-elected by the states in 1792. Adams once again won the vice presidency. Washington chose to retire at the end of his second term, hoping to set a precedent that executives would not continuously run for re-election in order to serve as president for life. After Washington, all U.S. presidents followed this custom, except Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who ran for 4 terms in the 1930s and 1940s. The 22nd Amendment of the U.S. Constitution in 1951 made it the law that the president could only serve 2 terms. The Bill of Rights was envisioned as a compromise between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists came to support the Bill of Rights because they saw it as the best way to ensure the Constitution was ratified. The Anti-Federalists believed that the Constitution could only work properly if the Bill of Rights were included, to restrain the power of the federal government to protect the rights of American citizens. The original Bill of Rights contained 10 amendments to the Constitution. We do not have time to go into all 10 of these amendments, but we will talk about a few of the amendments that directly addressed issues that 18th century Americans cared about the most. The First Amendment, what was really the third provision made by Congress during the Bill of Rights Convention, reads, quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances." End quote. The First Amendment would have been important to Americans during the 18th century because the American states, like the colonies before them, were religiously diverse, being home to Protestant Christians of a variety of sects, as well as some Catholics and a smaller number of Jews. Additionally, the level of religious commitment in American society varied as well, with richer people, influenced by the Enlightenment, being less religious, while lower-class people tended to be more devout. During colonial times, some colonies had theocratic governments, like Massachusetts. Theocracy had fallen out of favor in the late 1600s and early 1700s due to the Salem witch trials and the First Great Awakening, which we discussed before. The First Amendment was designed to be a compromise between all of these groups who had different ideas about which religion was best and what level of commitment people should have to their faith. In subsequent years, scholars, legislatures, and judges have debated the meaning and intent of this amendment. The First Amendment also guaranteed the right to free speech, peaceful protest, and a free press, since newspapers and protests had played a major role in the beginning of the American Revolution. The Second Amendment, or fourth provision, reads, quote, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed," end quote. Militias made up of armed everyday Americans had played a major role helping the Patriots win the American Revolutionary War. The militia had long acted as a constabulary, an internal security force in the American colonies, and it was being used that way in the new United States as well. While some militias paid for their members' firearms, many others expected militiamen to provide their own guns. As such, the framers of the Bill of Rights included the protection of citizens' rights to own firearms into the Bill of Rights. As is the case with the First Amendment, scholars, legislators, and judges have debated the meanings of the terms like regulated, militia, arms, and infringed within this amendment. What they would have meant to the framers of the Constitution versus what they mean today. Even at the time of the writing of the Bill of Rights, American political leaders debated how the American nation should see to its common defense, whether the country should continue to rely on militias or if a standing professional army should be kept. The Third Amendment is less controversial to us today than the First and Second Amendments are. Quote, "No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law," end quote. The Third Amendment specifically forbids the forced quartering of troops on civilian private property, a major grievance colonial Americans had held against the British government, helping to inspire the Revolutionary War. Amendments 4 through 8 all deal with the arrest and trial of defendants. These amendments protect Americans against unlawful searches and seizures, grant speedy trials by juries of peers, ensure that defendants are tried with the presumption of innocence, are not detained without evidence or charges, what we call habeas corpus, and that defendants not have to pay excessively high bail bonds. All of these provisions were important to Americans of the early republic, as the British government, during colonial times, in its prosecution of the Navigation Acts, had denied American smugglers all of these rights at one point or another. Finally, the Bill of Rights added additional checks and balances on the federal government by declaring Congress may not pass any laws or constitutional amendments that infringed on the Bill of Rights, and that powers not expressly given to the federal government must be in control of either the states or the American people as a whole. The U.S. Constitution is the oldest written, continually active Constitution in the world. It has also made the United States of America the longest-running representative democracy in the world as well. Our Constitution, with its three branches of government, its checks and balances, and its Bill of Rights, was intended to create a stable government that respected the rights of all citizens. While the Constitution did not extend civil rights to certain groups within U.S. society, women, enslaved people, and Native Americans, it laid the groundwork for the abolition of slavery in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, women's rights in the 19th Amendment, and it set the stage for Native Americans becoming U.S. citizens in 1924, although not all Native Americans would gain voting rights till 1957. Though the U.S. Constitution's initial flaws are obvious today, the original Constitution, with its plan for representative, democratic, Republican government, checks and balances on power, and protections of civil rights, was visionary in its time. It would inspire the formation of the governments of many other countries from the late 1700s and on. As its preamble states, the Constitution exists, quote, in order to form a more perfect union, end quote. To this end, scholars, lawmakers, and magistrates debate the Constitution, its language, the intention of the framers, and past interpretations of this document to better form and govern the United States of America. We've discussed the creation of the United States Constitution in great detail, who its authors and framers were, and what historical events inspired them to create the kind of document and government that they did. With this background in mind, we will return our discussion to the challenges of the early republic and its people in the late 1700s and early 1800s. As you know from before, the United States was financially strapped in its early years. The nation's paper currencies were highly inflated, and even after the creation of the U.S. Constitution, the American government struggled to pay its debts. One of the ways the new U.S. government paid its debts, especially to Revolutionary War participants, was to give tracts of land to patriot veterans, or to sell land to private buyers, whose payments would be used to fund veteran pensions. Much of the land the government parceled out and sold was in the Midwest, or the Northwest as it was called at the time. As settlers moved into the Northwest after the Revolutionary War ended, the U.S. Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which forbade the establishment of slavery in any state that was north of the Ohio River. The intention of the Northwest Ordinance was to make sure that the region would be populated by white farmers on small, independent tracts of land, rather than large plantations worked by black slaves for the benefit of a few white masters. In many ways, the Northwest Ordinance was very democratic and forward-thinking, as it allowed everyday Americans to acquire and purchase land for themselves in the Northwest. The problem with this plan, of course, was that much of this land was already occupied and inhabited by other people. Native Americans from a variety of backgrounds lived in the Northwest. Some had lived in the region for centuries, while others had arrived more recently, after being forced from their ancestral territories further to the east. The increased arrival of settlers, who traveled down the Ohio River and then moved northward into Indian country, would cause a series of wars between the United States and various Native American groups during the early Republic years. Ohio was the center of the fighting in the 1790s. A group of Native American tribes called the Western Confederacy, including the Miami, the Shawnee, and the Delaware, with British support, fought against the northward encroachment of white U.S. settlers. The Western Confederacy attacked settlements and drove off or killed the settlers. It failed to destroy large towns on the Ohio River, though, like Cincinnati, which was named after the Society of Cincinnati, which celebrated George Washington and veterans of the American Revolutionary War. In the fall of 1791, General Arthur St. Clair, who commanded a 1,000-man regiment of U.S. Army and militia troops, pressed north into Ohio. St. Clair was acting under orders of the first U.S. President, George Washington, who wanted the, quote, Indians and banditti of the region removed. Washington did not have a very high opinion of lower-class white Americans who were expanding onto the frontier, but he had no patience for the Native American Confederacy either, who saw the Ohio country as their home. The Native American Confederacy attacked St. Clair's force on November the 4th, 1791. They quickly surrounded his army and inflicted heavy casualties. At this fight, called the Battle of the Wabash, or St. Clair's defeat, the U.S. military suffered one of the greatest defeats in its history, sustaining over 900 casualties, or 90% of its force. The defeat was such a disaster that it provoked a congressional investigation and led to the creation of the modern-day presidential cabinet. St. Clair's defeat was emblematic of the problems the U.S. faced in the 1790s. The soldiers of the U.S. Army militias, due to financial problems, were poorly equipped and provisioned, and had very little training, whereas their enemies, the Native American Western Confederacy, received arms and materiel from the British. Additionally, the militia fought poorly in open battle, as seen during the American Revolutionary War. After St. Clair's defeat, the U.S. government put more energy and money into fighting the Native American Confederacy of Ohio. The Western Confederacy would ultimately be defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers on the 20th of August, 1794, by General Mad Anthony Wayne. The ensuing Treaty of Greenville in 1795 would force most Native Americans to leave Ohio, leaving the region mostly open for white American settlement. The United States conflict with the Western Confederacy, the first war the nation would fight on its own against Native Americans, was indicative of several trends that were evident in the U.S.'s wars with Indian tribes in the future. Native Americans could defeat the United States when their disparate tribes put their differences aside, finding a common enemy in the U.S. When Native Americans gained foreign support, especially from Great Britain, they would perform better as well. The United States would struggle to defeat Native Americans when it did not make its Indian wars a priority. When the U.S. did prioritize its fighting against Amerindians, though, the United States could use its superior numbers and greater resources to defeat Native Americans, forcing them from their homelands and onto reservations. While the war against the Western Confederacy confirmed the need for a standardized, well-funded, properly trained military, regulated in the 18th century parlance, the war failed to bring permanent peace to the Northwest. White settlers moved into Ohio, but they also moved into what is now the states of Indiana and Illinois, the new homes of the Indians who had been forced out of Ohio. The continued expansion of white American settlement in the Midwest, combined with financial support from British Canada, led the Native Americans of the Midwest to rise against the United States in the early 1800s. Tecumseh, a veteran of the Battle of the Wabash, would fight against the United States. He would unite Native Americans from a variety of backgrounds against the U.S., and with British support, leading to the War of 1812. At the same time as its war against the Western Confederacy, the United States was dealing with the frontier insurgency in western Pennsylvania. On the western frontier, especially in Pennsylvania, Americans produced whiskey, a spirituous liquor made from fermented and distilled corn mash. Whiskey, being that it could be cheaply made from American-grown maize, was becoming the nation's most popular alcoholic beverage, replacing the less potent apple cider, or rum, which had become associated with the British. On the frontier, farmers, lacking cash, as previously discussed, traded whiskey and used liquor as a sort of currency. Farmers also shipped whiskey to the East Coast for sale, since they would make a higher profit on corn spirits than they would on corn itself. When the U.S. government, spurred on by Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, began an excise tax on whiskey in late 1790, Western farmers became angry. The taxes from whiskey would be used to pay off debts and to strengthen the young nation's credit rating, but the farmers were largely unconcerned with these issues. Taxes were unpopular in the U.S., having been a primary motive for the Revolutionary War, and the Western farmers refused to pay the duties on the spirits that were their livelihood. The farmers believed that Eastern elitists like Hamilton were trying to drive them into poverty, while not spending enough money to protect them from the Native Americans in Ohio. In this way, the Whiskey Rebellion bore some striking similarities to Bacon's Rebellion of 1676 to 1677, which we discussed in a previous video. The Western farmers and distillers opposed the taxes through protests and by attacking tax collectors. In 1794, the federal government stepped up the enforcement of the taxes by issuing subpoenas to 60 frontier distillers. The writs were served with the assistance of U.S. Army soldiers. After the killing of an anti-tax frontiersman, farmers and distillers took up arms against the federal government. In response, President George Washington and Congress called up the militia from Pennsylvania and several other states to put down the armed insurrection on the Keystone State's frontier. Washington himself oversaw the federalized militias march into Pennsylvania in October of 1794. In the face of overwhelming force, the whiskey rebels mostly dispersed. Out of the rebellion's 24 leaders, 10 were captured and 2 were sentenced to be executed, but they were eventually pardoned by President Washington, who believed that clemency was the best way to prevent future rebellions. The hated whiskey taxes would ultimately be repealed by the third U.S. President, Thomas Jefferson, who promised to abolish these duties to gain Western votes. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 showed that a balance was necessary between the ideals of the American Revolution and the U.S. Constitution. Resistance to taxes had inspired the American Revolutionary War, leading to the creation of the United States, but the new American nation needed revenue as well. To satisfy both ideals, the U.S. government, until the War of 1812, would not directly tax its people, but would instead rely on tariffs to gain revenue. Now that we've discussed some major political and economic issues the United States encountered during the early Republican years, we will discuss American culture and society and some emerging social ideals that were coming to fruition in this period. As you know, the American people in the 1780s were divided over the U.S. Constitution and the political stances of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists supported the Constitution and wanted to see the power of the federal government increased. The Federalists tended to come from eastern U.S. urban centers, or they tended to be very wealthy or privileged economically, although there were some exceptions. Alexander Hamilton, the quintessential Federalist, came from very humble beginnings, being born to a poor woman in Barbados and growing up without a father in his life. Federalists also tended to support more hierarchical social systems, believing that the elites should have more control of the federal government than the lower classes, and that poor Americans should show deference to their betters in the upper class. George Washington, the first U.S. president, was a good example of a Federalist president. Washington, though he mistrusted Native Americans, also did not like lower-class American frontiersmen who lived without laws or government on the frontier, causing wars with Indians. Federalists tended to be less enthusiastic about westward expansion, worrying that the federal government would not be able to control the frontiersmen as the nation expanded westward. Federalists also emphasized trade with foreign nations, especially Great Britain, as being the key to the nation's future. John Adams, America's second president, was this kind of pro-British Federalist. These aforementioned leaders would work to turn the Federalist movement into the nation's first political party. Out of the ashes of the Anti-Federalist movement came a new political party to counter the Federalists, the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans tended to come from frontier states like Kentucky, or from less settled parts of the original 13 states. Democratic Republicans tended to view that the prosperity of the nation lay in westward expansion and agrarianism. The Democratic Republicans emphasized classical ideals like Greco-Roman virtue. They believed that only independent farmers who lived on self-sufficient farms could be good citizens. Independent, self-sufficient agrarian citizens, called yeomen, would use the government to promote the general welfare rather than special interests. Perhaps the most important leader of the early Democratic-Republican Party was Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence and third President of the United States. Keep in mind that Jefferson was also a very wealthy man and a member of the Virginia gentry, and a large slave owner as well. He did not fit the ideal of the Democratic-Republican citizen. The Democratic-Republicans also believed in foreign trade, but they thought that the U.S.'s closest trading partner ought to be France, the country's first ally, rather than Britain, its former enemy. When people study the Federalist and Democratic-Republican parties, they often impose modern-day divisions from current politics onto these centuries-old political factions. Some people think of the Federalists as being the progressive party, while they think of the Democratic-Republicans as being conservatives. In fact, both parties had their own progressive and conservative wings, and both parties made appeals to both traditionalistic and forward-thinking Americans. The Federalists' commitment to social stratification would certainly not fit with the egalitarian values of progressivism, and the Democratic Republicans' populistic stances on land use and its alliances with revolutionary France would hardly be called conservative. Therefore, I do not want you all to think of the Federalists or the Democratic Republicans as being either all progressive or all conservative. Rather, these parties' allegiances were determined by regional needs far more than social views. The Federalists continued their rule of the United States with the election of John Adams to the presidency in the 1796 election. Adams won most of the smaller states in the North, while Thomas Jefferson, the vice president, won most of the frontier and southern states. Keep in mind that Adams won Maryland, a southern slave state, while Jefferson won Pennsylvania, a free state with a large frontier and site of the Whiskey Rebellion. Jefferson was popular with voters in the Appalachian region because he was opposed to the excise tax on whiskey, which we discussed previously. As president, Adams wanted to improve relations with Great Britain, the world's foremost imperial power and the greatest military threat to the United States. To this end, Adams wanted to distance the U.S. from France, its former ally. Adams and the Federalists witnessed the ongoing French Revolution, its violent egalitarianism during the Reign of Terror, and wanted to prevent such ideas from taking root in the United States. The French had also been putting pressure on the United States since Jay's Treaty of 1794, in which John Jay had negotiated the British evacuation of Fort Detroit and several other settlements now in the U.S. The British agreed to give up their forts in exchange for favored nation trading rights. The French, in response, began allowing their privateers to raid American shipping, since they were currently at war with Great Britain. President Adams sent diplomats to France to try to convince the French to stop their attacks on American shipping. The French Foreign Minister, Charles Talleyrand, demanded that American diplomats pay him a bribe before he negotiated with them. The U.S. diplomats, viewing this demand as an insult on their national sovereignty, refused, leading to a breakdown in diplomatic relations between France and the United States, what was called the QuasiWar of 1798 through 1800. In the Quasi-War, the U.S. entered a brief naval war with France, but it did so without a declaration of war from Congress, hence the use of the word quasi in its name. Congress did not declare war, but it did authorize the reestablishment of the U.S. Navy to counter French piracy on the high seas. The Navy had been decommissioned after the end of the Revolutionary War to cut costs. The war ended in 1800 with Napoleon Bonaparte's takeover of France. Bonaparte and the Americans, with the help of the British, made an agreement to protect American neutrality on the high seas, allowing the U.S. to trade with both nations, even as they continued to fight each other. Although the Quasi-War was short, with very few casualties, the conflict would have a major impact on American society. In response to the war, Adams and the Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Sedition Act made speech against the U.S. government illegal, a clear violation of the First Amendment. The Alien Act included two provisions, the Alien Friends Act and the Alien Enemies Act. The Alien Friends Act allowed for the imprisonment and deportation of immigrants deemed to be acting against the federal government, and it increased the time required to naturalize, to become a U.S. citizen. The Alien Enemies Act allowed for the deportation of immigrants from hostile foreign nations. A revised version of the Alien Enemies Act is still active today. The Sedition and Alien Friends Act inspired in 1800 and 1801, respectively. The Alien and Sedition Acts were intended primarily to control the immigration of French refugees, whose migration push factors were the violence and chaos of revolutionary France. Their pull factors would have been the relative freedom of the U.S. Adams and the Federalists were concerned that some of the refugees might try to start a revolution in the United States, or drag the U.S. into war against Britain. The actions of French envoy Charles Edmond Genet, Citizen Genet, who tried to recruit American privateers to raid British shipping, were a threat to the U.S. government. Democratic Republicans, who tended to be more sympathetic to France, condemned the Alien and Sedition Acts as a violation of the Constitution and a major government overreach. The Democratic Republicans also condemned the acts as xenophobic and anti-French. Democratic Republicans passed the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which called for states to disobey the laws that were deemed to be unconstitutional. The Alien and Sedition Acts, and the acrimonious response to them, damaged the reputation of the Federalist Party and helped Thomas Jefferson defeat incumbent John Adams during the 1800 presidential election. Divisions in the Federalist Party between Adams and Alexander Hamilton contributed to the Federalists' loss in 1800 as well. Hamilton was seen as corrupt by many Americans, and his ties to the Federalist Party damaged the Federalist reputation across the country. Jefferson won the presidential election of 1800, and the second-place winner was Aaron Burr, who became vice president. As president, Thomas Jefferson implemented many tenets of the Democratic-Republican Party. Jefferson did away with much of the pomp and ceremony surrounding the office of president to make the country in a more egalitarian, less stratified direction. While President Washington had respected the office of president, Jefferson felt that the most respectful thing he could do as president would be to represent the chief executive as a man of the people. To this end, Jefferson rejected his predecessor's more formal style, seeing it as elitist and monarchical. Remember that Jefferson was himself a very wealthy man and a member of the national elite. Jefferson also pushed forward a series of policies that appealed to Democratic Republicans, like the cancellation of the hated whiskey excise tax, which disproportionately affected rural Americans. Even though he got rid of some taxes, Jefferson made paying down the U.S. national debt a major priority of his administration. Federalists were less concerned about the national debt. Alexander Hamilton even thought that a national debt, if kept under control, could be a good thing, as it would tie the American nation to business interests, who would purchase U.S. government bonds. Even though he generally lowered taxes, Jefferson worked to lower the national debt because he and Democratic Republicans believed that debt made the U.S. government dependent on wealthy bankers. The Democratic Republicans generally hated banks, and they thought they were dangerous and corrupt. Jefferson, who supported the ideals of both the American and French revolutions, believed that there should be equality amongst all U.S. citizens, assuming they were male and white. Any institution that got in the way of the agrarian, democratic, Republican ideals, whether it was banks, the federal government bureaucracy, or even the military, should be eliminated, or at least weakened and reformed. To combat Federalist influence in the U.S. Army, Jefferson authorized the creation of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York, in 1802. West Point would produce a new, egalitarian officer corps whose cadets would be nominated by Congress based on their own merit, rather than their family name or their ancestors' military service. Jefferson also shrank the U.S. Navy to cut costs, believing that a standing Navy was unnecessary in peacetime. Jefferson, like many Democratic Republicans, generally distrusted professional armies, believing they were a threat to liberty. Jefferson believed that the nation's defense should be overseen primarily by citizen militias. Jefferson believed that if the U.S. had to have a professional army, then it should be small and apolitical. Of all the pieces of legislation that were passed by Jefferson during his presidency, the most famous by far was the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. In the Louisiana Purchase, the U.S. bought the Louisiana Territory, which included much of the American West, from France. France had regained this territory from Spain in 1801, but Napoleon Bonaparte, the French emperor, sold the territory to the U.S. after determining that France could not maintain control of this land, as it was currently fighting Great Britain, who controlled Canada. France also needed the money because it was struggling to retake its colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti. The U.S. paid France 15 million USD, about $350 million today, for the territory, with a down payment of $3 million in gold. As a result of French desperation, the U.S. had gotten a great deal in the Louisiana Territory, paying about cents per acre. The U.S. had bought land that was inhabited by Native Americans, Frenchmen, Spaniards, slaves, and free blacks, who were not permitted to have a say in the sale. Their lands had been transferred from one nation to another without their consent. There were also disagreements between the U.S., Britain, and Spain as to the boundaries of Louisiana as well. American critics of the Louisiana Purchase, primarily Federalists, argued that Jefferson did not have the authority to buy such a large tract of land, even though the purchase was approved by Congress. Proponents of the purchase argued that President Jefferson, as chief executive, was also the nation's chief diplomat and could make treaties with foreign powers. Supporters also argued that even if the purchase was illegal and might lead to friction with Native Americans, Britain, or Spain, they pragmatically supported the deal because it nearly doubled the size of the United States for a very low price. To chart the Louisiana Territory and map it out for American settlement, Jefferson commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, brother of George Rogers Clark, whom we discussed previously, to explore the territory along the Missouri River. Lewis and Clark and their party, the Corps of Discovery, traveled up the Missouri River, finding its source in the Rocky Mountains, which they discovered were far higher and more rugged than the Appalachians in the east. Lewis and Clark sought guides and intermediaries from amongst the populace of the territory, including Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman, who was married to a French trader. Sacagawea and her infant son's presence helped to ease tensions between the Corps of Discovery and the Native American tribes who lived in the West. The expedition was primarily peaceful, with only one casualty, who died of disease. The Corps of Discovery reached the Pacific coast, not technically part of the purchase, in the fall of 1805. The Corps of Discovery then returned to the eastern U.S. and arrived in St. Louis in September of 1806. The Lewis and Clark expedition was both historically and scientifically significant. The Corps of Discovery claimed large parts of the American West for the United States, making maps and dividing the region for future white settlement. The Corps also conducted scientific surveys, studying the flora and fauna that were relatively unknown to white Americans, like the prairie dog and the bison of the Great Plains. During his presidency, Jefferson weakened the power of the federal government by cutting spending, paying down the national debt, and retiring the U.S. Navy. At the same time, Jefferson also expanded the power of the federal government, especially the executive branch, by purchasing the Louisiana Territory from France. While Jefferson's purchase of Louisiana benefited the U.S., his decision to mothball the Navy had negative consequences. While Britain and France recognized the neutrality of American shipping, at least officially, other nations did not. Some nations that did not respect American neutrality were Tripolitania and Morocco on the Mediterranean coast of North Africa. Pirates from Algiers, an Islamic Arab state, had raided coastal Europe since the 1500s, taking captives from places as far north as Ireland. The captives were taken back to Algiers and sold as slaves, with as many as 1.25 million being captured between the 16th and 19th centuries. The kidnappings had died down in the late 1700s, as European, especially British, naval power had increased. American ships in the region, however, were ripe for the taking, because the U.S. had no navy and Britain no longer protected American shipping as it had in colonial times. The Barbary pirates seized American goods and captured American sailors, for whom they demanded a ransom. If the U.S. government refused to pay, the captured sailors were enslaved. Since the 1780s, the U.S. had paid the ransoms to get the sailors back. Jefferson had called for the U.S. to take a harder line against the pirates, leading Tripoli to declare war on the U.S. in 1801. The U.S. fought the Barbary states until 1805. During the war, the U.S. made use of several new frigates which Jefferson had ordered, reversing his decision to cut down the Navy. The United States Marine Corps also saw action in the Barbary War as well, capturing enemy ships and raising the American flag over Derna on the shores of Tripoli. The First Barbary War, in the end, was a massive success for the United States. It was the nation's first real foreign war, not counting the QuasiWar. It demonstrated the United States could protect itself without assistance from Great Britain, and it showed the efficacy of the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, who ensured the nation's victory over the Barbary states. While the U.S. had defeated the small and relatively weak Barbary states, it would struggle on the high seas against Great Britain, the world's foremost naval power. Jefferson, who had been elected to a second term in 1804, understood this. Britain, still at war with France, had begun to intercept American merchant vessels that were bound for France, even though the U.S. had neutral status. The British searched American vessels for deserters from the British Navy. It was common for British sailors, many of whom had been kidnapped or pressed into service, to desert once their vessel docked in an American port. The British Navy paid low wages and had very strict discipline. So service as a civilian mariner was far more attractive. American naval officers and civilian captains refused to return their British crewmen over to the Royal Navy, arguing that the sailors were American now and had no allegiance to the crown. In response, British vessels began to seize any sailor their officers suspected was a deserter, even natural-born Americans. On one particularly infamous occasion, the British vessel HMS Leopard fired upon and seized the USS Chesapeake off the coast of Virginia. The Leopard was after British deserters, but they also captured American citizens as well. One of the men they seized was Daniel Martin, a black man who had lived in Massachusetts since childhood. The interdiction of American shipping on the high seas and the impressment of sailors serving aboard U.S. vessels angered many Americans, who viewed the seizures as a violation of their national sovereignty. More aggressive Democratic Republicans, who tended to hate the British, called for war against Britain, while the more pro-British, trade-minded Federalists called for a peaceful resolution, and pointed out that the French occasionally seized American shipping as well. In response, the U.S. passed the Embargo Act of 1807, which forbade all foreign trade. This decision, which was meant to be a compromise, angered both Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Federalists were angry that they could not trade with Europe, and Democratic Republicans saw this act as a massive government overreach. The act was a failure and damaged President Jefferson's credibility in the final years of his presidency. While the Embargo Act was a failure, another piece of legislation, the abolition of the United States slave trade, was a success. It was signed into law in 1807, but it began in 1808. The horrors of the Middle Passage, as the slaves' involuntary journey from Africa to the Americas was called, were becoming more well known to white people in the United States. Although the decision to abolish their African slave trade was driven by more pragmatic factors as well. Abolitionists hoped that the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade by both the U.S. and Great Britain would have a domino effect, leading to the end of slavery. Pro-slavery Americans, however, were willing to end the trade because they could simply purchase black slaves that were born in the U.S. or other parts of the Americas. How did the transatlantic slave trade actually work? European slavers, learning from the Arab slave traders who came before them, made deals with various African kingdoms and peoples, funding wars and selling weapons to various powers in West and Central Africa. In exchange for these weapons, the African kingdoms would give their prisoners of war to European slavers, who would then load their human cargo onto cramped ships bound for the Americas. Contrary to popular belief, Europeans rarely left the African coast in pursuit of captives themselves. Diseases like malaria were endemic in the African interior, and Europeans did not have immunity to these illnesses. Additionally, the various and diverse African kingdoms and ethnic groups, the Akan, the Bakongo, the Igbos, the Wolof, and the Yoruba, and others, were often at war with each other, partially to gain captives for sale. This destructive warfare made travel in the African interior dangerous for Europeans who had little knowledge of the conditions away from the coast. European slavers would instead buy/trade for African prisoners, whom they would load onto slave ships in chains for their miserable journey to the Americas. According to the U.S.'s 1800 census, there were 900,000 enslaved Africans living in the United States, primarily in the South, out of a population of about 5 million free people. From the 1600s to the 1800s, nearly 400,000 Africans have been forcibly transferred to America in the Atlantic World's Triangle trade, which we've discussed previously. The transatlantic slave trade, unfortunately, would continue even after it was banned in the U.S. and Britain. Spain and Portugal would continue the import of enslaved people to their remaining American colonies as late as 1870. In all, about 12 million Africans were kidnapped from Africa and sold in the Americas. The vast majority were sold in the Caribbean and Brazil, where disease was a much greater killer than it was in North America, necessitating continued importation of enslaved people. About 1.5 million Africans would die in the Middle Passage sailing ordeal, never making it to the Americas. I bring up these points because I want you all to realize that humanitarianism was not the primary motivator for the American Congress's vote to end its transatlantic slave trade. White Americans recognized that the enslaved population was growing through natural increase, 1.2 million by 1810 and 1.5 million by 1820, not because they treated their slaves well, but because the North American climate was far healthier than that of Brazil and the Caribbean, where slave populations could only be sustained through constant import due to disease. Observing the Haitian Revolution, slave masters recognized that enslaved Africans who remembered a life of freedom in Africa were far less likely to revolt for their liberty, far more likely to revolt for their liberty than enslaved people who were country-born, having inherited a life of slavery. Additionally, white Americans had long recognized that enslaved insurrections would become more common and be more likely to succeed as slave numbers increased and even outpaced the white population, as shown by the Haitian Revolution and other slave revolts, both in North America and in the Caribbean. So, while it was a good thing that the U.S. stopped taking part in the transatlantic slave trade, the decision was not entirely driven out of altruism, as Southerners recognized they were better off purchasing enslaved Africans than they were buying kidnapped slaves from Africa. Anyway, back to Jefferson. Jefferson did not seek re-election in 1808, preferring to retire to his plantation in Virginia, Monticello. Unfortunately, we do not have time to discuss Jefferson's personal life, his architectural achievements, his scientific studies, his spiritual beliefs, or his personal relationships. Suffice to say that he was and remains a very complicated and enigmatic figure. While his presidency may have gone out with a whimper instead of a bang, with the escalation of tensions with Great Britain and the failure of the Embargo Act, Jefferson is viewed as a successful American president. Jefferson doubled the size of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase, founded the U.S. Military Academy, oversaw America's first victory in a foreign war, and helped to spread revolutionary egalitarianism, at least among white male Americans. In the end, Jefferson is considered a successful president, even if there were some unresolved issues that lingered after his presidency. Jefferson was succeeded by James Madison, a former Federalist who became a Democratic Republican, serving as Jefferson's Secretary of State. Madison tried to continue Jefferson's policy of neutrality between Britain and France, but the Federalists, who wanted to trade with Britain, opposed him. Additionally, Madison struggled to maintain support of a new generation of Democratic Republican politicians called warhawks, including Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, who wanted war with Great Britain. As relations with Britain continued to deteriorate throughout his first term, Madison eventually called for war with Great Britain, and Congress officially declared war on June 1, 1812, beginning the War of 1812. We will discuss this conflict in a future video. (1783) through 1812 was a busy, eventful, and chaotic time in U.S. history. The new American nation, still shaky and weak from its War of Independence with Great Britain, struggled to pay its debts and defend its people. Events like the Newburgh Conspiracy and Daniel Shays' Rebellion convinced American politicians that a stronger federal government was needed, leading to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The Constitution gave the United States a federal government with three branches: a legislative, executive, and judicial branch, each of which would check the other's power. The Constitution also included a Bill of Rights, which restrained the government's power over the people. The states finished ratifying the Constitution in 1789. The United States also discovered that to adequately defend itself, a standing army and navy were necessary, as seen during the war against the Western Confederation in Ohio, the Whiskey Rebellion, and the Barbary War. Federalists and Anti-Federalists, the future Democratic Republicans, debated the role the federal government should play in the development of the American nation. The Federalists generally supported a larger government that protected American trade and preserved social hierarchies, as seen by the policies of Alexander Hamilton and Presidents George Washington and John Adams. The Democratic Republicans, former Anti-Federalists, wanted a smaller, cheaper, less intrusive federal government that did not interfere with the lives of the nation's agrarian citizens. Nonetheless, Thomas Jefferson, the first Democratic Republican president, grew the power of the federal government by purchasing Louisiana, fighting the Barbary War, and allowing the passing of the Embargo Act. Some historians say that Jefferson accomplished his own Jeffersonian Democratic-Republican goals through Federalist Hamiltonian means. Unresolved issues during the early Republic, from British-instigated Native American attacks on the frontier to the Royal Navy's continued violation of U.S. sovereignty on the high seas, kept the U.S. in a precarious position, forcing the young republic to go to war against its old enemy in 1812.